The Galactic Empire's emissary stood at the center of Earth's largest diplomatic chamber, its presence an unspoken reminder of the power it represented. Draped in shimmering black robes, its elongated skull and featureless silver eyes surveyed the room with an air of absolute certainty. It was not here to negotiate. It was here to deliver a demand. A hush fell over the gathered leaders of Earth. Presidents, prime ministers, generals, and diplomats, all present, all waiting. Every nation had set aside their differences, unified in a way that had never happened before. They all understood what was at stake. The emissary's voice was artificial, translated through a device that turned its native chittering into something cold, calculated. "You will submit," it said, its tone devoid of inflection. "Humanity will accept the rule of the Galactic Empire. Your world will be integrated. Your people will serve. Your culture will dissolve, irrelevant in the face of galactic order. Resistance is not an option." It raised a thin, clawed hand and a three-dimensional projection flickered into existence above the conference table. A planet, alien and unfamiliar, rotated slowly in space. This was the homeworld of the Vishali. The emissary continued. The projection shifted, the planet now pockmarked with craters, entire continents scorched black. They resisted. They no longer exist. Silence. The weight of those words pressed down on the room, but no one spoke. The projection changed again, cycling through other species, other worlds. Each a graveyard. The message was clear. You have 24 hours to decide. If you comply, the transition will be orderly. If you resist, your suffering will be brief but absolute. The emissary paused, allowing the words to settle, then added one final statement. Understand this. There has never been an exception. With that, it turned and walked toward the chamber's exit. No further discussion. No debate. It had delivered the will of the Empire, and in its mind, the matter was already decided. Humanity would surrender. They always did. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, as the doors closed behind the emissary, the room erupted. Some leaders, those who had seen war firsthand, understood immediately what was at stake. There could be no surrender, not to a force like this. Others, more cautious, suggested compliance, at least as a temporary measure. There were those who argued for time, more time to prepare, to understand the enemy. But one thing was certain, the threat was real, and the clock was ticking. Within hours, Earth's military and scientific minds gathered. A rapid assessment was made. The Empire's technology was far beyond humanity's own, their fleet numbering in the tens of thousands. They had weapons capable of reducing entire continents to rubble in seconds. Against such power, conventional resistance seemed suicidal. But humanity had something the Empire did not. They were new to the galactic stage, underestimated, viewed as primitives. That was an advantage. The Empire's doctrine was clear. They expected submission, not defiance. Their victories had made them predictable, complacent. And predictable enemies could be defeated. The decision was made. There would be no surrender. Not because humanity believed it could win, but because it understood the cost of obedience. There was no future under the Empire's rule, only extinction stretched across centuries. A slow, methodical erasure. Their history, their culture, their very identity would be swallowed and forgotten. The galaxy might have accepted that fate. Humanity would not. A message was prepared. Not a speech, not a plea. Just a single word, sent directly to the Empire's command ship. No. The reaction was immediate. Across the Sol system, every military force went on high alert. Defensive satellites activated. Asteroid mining stations were hastily converted into makeshift weapons platforms. Cyberwarfare divisions worked without rest, searching for weaknesses in the Empire's systems. The best and brightest minds devised strategies that had never been considered before. The Empire expected planetary defenses, massive fleet engagements, armies clashing on the surface. Humanity would not give them that. They would fight differently. They would fight smarter. The Empire's emissary did not respond. It had not expected an answer at all, much less outright defiance. But the lack of response was not silence. It was calculation. Somewhere, deep within the Empire's hierarchy, the wheels of war began to turn. The galaxy watched. Other species, those who had already fallen under the Empire's rule, observed the defiance of this young, reckless species. Some pitied them, certain that their destruction was inevitable. Others dared to feel something else: hope. If humanity could stand, if they could resist even for a moment, it would prove something long thought impossible. It would prove that the Empire was not invincible. And so the countdown continued. 24 hours. The Empire had never made exceptions. The message was sent. Nothing more needed to be said. The decision had been made, and humanity braced for the consequences. There was no panic, no mass hysteria. There was only purpose. Within hours, every government had shifted from debate to execution. Plans that had only existed in theory were now being implemented with ruthless efficiency. Every satellite in orbit was repurposed. Civilian systems were converted into surveillance networks, scanning deep space for any sign of incoming movement. Military command centers coordinated a global defense effort. Factories stopped producing consumer goods and switched to weapons manufacturing. The transformation was immediate, absolute. There was no more doubt, no hesitation. Every major space station in the solar system was reinforced. Civilian outposts became strongholds. The mining facilities in the asteroid belt, once dedicated to extracting raw materials, were hastily modified. Their enormous machinery was reprogrammed to turn asteroids into kinetic weapons. Giant chunks of rock were fitted with engines, prepped for launch at a moment's notice. If the Empire came, they wouldn't just be fighting ships. They'd be fighting the very system itself. Earth's fleets mobilized. While primitive compared to the Empire's warships, they were fast, heavily armed, and built for adaptability. Humanity had never fought a war in space, not on this scale, but that didn't matter. Every pilot, every engineer, every strategist understood one simple fact: if they failed, there would be no second chance. The Cyberwarfare Division worked without pause. Their goal was not just to defend but to infiltrate. The Empire relied on technology, and technology could be exploited. Every signal, every piece of data that could be intercepted was analyzed for weaknesses. The first wave of attacks wouldn't be physical. It would be digital. Across the world, humanity's greatest minds gathered in underground bunkers, developing new weapons, refining battle tactics, anticipating the enemy's every move. Some focused on the known, studying what little data they had on the Empire's previous conquests. Others prepared for the unknown, thinking beyond traditional warfare, pushing past conventional strategy. For centuries, war had been about brute force. The Empire had perfected that doctrine. But brute force could be countered. Predictability was a flaw, and humanity had no intention of playing by the Empire's rules. They would not meet the enemy in open battle. They would not stand in formation and be cut down. They would strike from the shadows, turn every engagement into a trap, every weakness into an opportunity. The colonies on Mars and the moons of Jupiter were given one directive: prepare for total independence. Earth might fall, but humanity would not. Vast underground bunkers were expanded, supply lines rerouted, contingency plans established. If the worst happened, survivors would retreat into the depths of space, regroup, and continue the fight. The Empire might be able to destroy a planet, but it could not exterminate an idea. Scientists worked on last resort measures, weapons of desperation. There were no ethical debates now, no concerns over morality. If the Empire forced their hand, the response would be absolute. The black sites hidden in the most remote regions of the system operated at full capacity, experimenting with technologies humanity had never dared to use before. This was not just about survival. It was about making sure the Empire paid for every inch of ground they took. Time moved too quickly. Every hour brought them closer to the inevitable. The world held its breath, waiting for the first sign of retaliation. Every telescope, every sensor array was trained toward deep space, searching. Nothing yet. But it was coming. Everyone knew it. Messages were sent out, not of surrender, but of defiance. Old allies, distant colonies, even conquered species, all were listening. Some responded with fear, urging Earth to reconsider. Others remained silent, unwilling to risk drawing the Empire's gaze. But a few, just a few, sent quiet transmissions of support. They were small, insignificant on their own. A handful of ships, a trickle of resources. It wasn't much, but it meant something. It meant humanity was not alone. The soldiers of Earth prepared, but they were not the same as the armies of old. This was not a fight of nation against nation, ideology against ideology. This was the fight of a species against extinction. The soldiers were not fighting for a flag. They were fighting for their families, for their future, for the right to exist. They drilled in abandoned cities, in underground tunnels, in the frozen wastelands of Antarctica. They prepared for planetary invasions, for urban warfare, for battles in the void of space. The simulations were brutal, the training relentless. Death was not a possibility. It was an expectation. And yet not a single soldier hesitated. The fleet commanders ran war games, testing every possible scenario. What would happen if the Empire attacked from orbit? How would they respond to planetary bombardment? What if communications were severed? No detail was too small, no scenario too extreme. Every plan had contingencies, every contingency had backups. There would be no surprises. The spies, the saboteurs, the ones who worked in the shadows, prepared their own war. They did not wield rifles or command ships. Their weapons were deception, misinformation, subterfuge. They studied the Empire's weaknesses, searching for cracks in its foundation. If they could not defeat it in battle, they would dismantle it from within. Every piece was in motion. Every soldier, every scientist, every strategist played their role. There was no guarantee of victory. The only certainty was that when the Empire arrived, it would not find an easy conquest. It would not see fear. It would see a species that had already accepted the cost of war and refused to bow. The countdown continued. Humanity had made its choice. Now it was the Empire's move. The moment the Empire's fleet emerged from hyperspace, every system in the Soul Defense Network registered it instantly. Hundreds of ships, each the size of a city, their hulls black against the void, bristling with weapons capable of reducing a planet to ash. There was no fanfare, no warning beyond the 24-hour ultimatum that had long since passed. They had come to enforce their demand, expecting the battle to be swift, the outcome inevitable. But the Empire had never faced an enemy like humanity. Before the first energy bolt was fired, before the Empire's commanders had issued their opening orders, the war had already begun. The moment their ships arrived, they triggered a response they had not anticipated. Signals embedded in the fabric of their own communication relays had been altered, subtly rewritten by the cyberwarfare divisions of Earth. It was not a complete takeover. Humanity's technology was not so advanced as to hijack an entire fleet, but it was enough. Orders were scrambled, fleet coordination momentarily fractured. In an empire where obedience was absolute, where hierarchy was unquestioned, that moment of hesitation was an opening. The first strikes came from the darkness. Unmanned drones, no larger than escape pods, drifted among the asteroid belt, lying in wait. As the Empire's forward ships passed, the drones ignited their engines, accelerating to impossible speeds, each one a projectile of pure kinetic energy. Shields designed to withstand plasma bursts and energy cannons struggled against the raw force of high-velocity impacts. The lead warship took 3 direct hits. Its hull held, but fractures spread through its structure like cracks in glass. It would still function, but its combat efficiency was already compromised. Then came the mines. Hundreds of them, scattered throughout the void, cloaked by electromagnetic interference, indistinguishable from debris. The moment the Empire's ships drifted into range, the mines activated, each releasing an electromagnetic pulse that disrupted targeting systems and sensor arrays. The Empire's doctrine had always assumed they would control the battlefield. Now they were blind in an enemy's home territory. It was not a battle in the way the Empire understood. There was no grand fleet engagement, no honorable stand. Humanity did not meet them head-on. It struck from the shadows, vanished, then struck again. Every asteroid, every satellite, every abandoned station had been turned into a weapon. The Empire had come to conquer a planet, but they had stepped into a war zone where every piece of space had been meticulously prepared for their arrival. And then Earth's fleet moved. They were smaller, weaker in direct combat, but they were fast. They didn't form rigid formations like the Empire's ships. They attacked from unexpected angles, striking and disappearing before the enemy could return fire. Every ship operated independently, each following its own erratic patterns. They wove through the chaos, launching precise strikes at weak points, never lingering long enough for the enemy to bring their full power to bear. The Empire's response was brutal. Its ships unleashed waves of plasma fire, their weapons turning empty space into a storm of destruction. They did not care for elegance or efficiency. They fired in all directions, hoping to catch the elusive enemy. They targeted their own disrupted ships, sacrificing them if it meant hitting the attackers hiding within their ranks. To them, losses were irrelevant. Humanity had limited resources. The Empire had entire armadas. But raw power was not enough. Humanity had expected this response. They had studied the Empire's battles, seen how it crushed resistance through overwhelming force. And so they had designed their strategy around that very arrogance. While the fleet kept the enemy occupied, Earth's greatest weapon moved into place. The repurposed mining stations scattered throughout the asteroid belt had not been turned into weapons just for defense. They had another purpose. With a coordinated activation, their massive engines roared to life, pushing entire asteroids onto collision courses with the Empire's fleet. These were not small, inconsequential rocks. They were mountains in motion, each one carrying enough kinetic energy to shatter a warship on impact. The Empire's commanders, trained to fight enemies that relied on fleet engagements, suddenly found themselves in the middle of a planetary-scale bombardment. Some ships managed to evade, shifting position at the last moment. Others were not so fortunate. The first impact sent a shockwave through the battlefield, a vessel crushed between two colliding asteroids, its reinforced hull caving like paper. The destruction did not stop. More asteroids followed, each one guided by humanity's remote stations, each one aimed with precision. The Empire's formation, already struggling against a decentralized enemy, was now collapsing under the sheer unpredictability of the battlefield. But humanity knew this was only the beginning. The Empire would adapt. It always did. It had resources beyond comprehension, the ability to call in reinforcements that would dwarf this initial attack force. If this battle lasted too long, if the fight turned into attrition, humanity would lose. So they forced the next stage. While the fleet and asteroid bombardment occupied the bulk of the Empire's forces, another operation was already underway. Stealth craft, barely larger than shuttles, had maneuvered unnoticed through the chaos, weaving through debris and wreckage, avoiding active scans. Their target was not the warships themselves but something far more valuable. The Empire's flagship was the keystone of the entire fleet, not just in firepower but in command. It housed the highest-ranking officers, the central communication hub, the mind that coordinated the entire battle. Every Empire fleet relied on its flagship as the center of operations, ensuring that all ships operated under the same strategic command. And it was this singular reliance that humanity sought to exploit. The stealth ships closed in, evading automated defenses, bypassing layers of security protocols. When they struck, they did not use weapons. They did not need to. Instead, they unleashed a virus, a program crafted with one singular purpose: to turn the Empire's own command structure against itself. Within seconds, the flagship's internal systems were compromised. Orders were scrambled, targeting systems malfunctioned, entire divisions of the fleet received conflicting instructions. Some ships were given retreat coordinates, others were directed into the heart of battle. The chaos that had already plagued the Empire's fleet now spiraled into absolute disorder. And that was when humanity struck with everything it had. The remaining warships, the hidden stations, the repurposed satellites, every weapon that had been held in reserve was unleashed in a single, coordinated attack. The goal was not to destroy the entire fleet. That was impossible. But the flagship had to fall. The command structure had to be broken. A final barrage of kinetic strikes, electromagnetic pulses, and focused energy beams targeted the crippled vessel. The flagship, once the heart of the fleet, now struggled to maintain even the most basic functions. Its defenses failed, its shields flickered and collapsed. The last transmission it sent was a desperate call for reinforcements, cut short as the final impact tore through its structure, ripping it apart from within. The explosion that followed was visible from Earth's surface, a silent bloom of fire and debris expanding into the void. And in that moment, the battle was decided. The Empire's fleet, leaderless, disorganized, and under relentless assault, began to break apart. Some ships attempted to fight on, but without coordination, they were easy prey. Others, realizing the battle was lost, turned and fled, their captains unwilling to throw themselves into certain death. Humanity had not won the war. That was still to come. But in this moment, against all odds, it had won the first battle. It had done what no other species had ever accomplished. It had made the Empire bleed. The wreckage of the Empire's fleet drifted through space, broken hulls spinning in the void, shattered remnants of what had once been an unstoppable armada. Fires still burned in the oxygen-rich pockets of their ruined ships, flickering like dying stars. The battle had been brutal, but it was over. Humanity had done the impossible. The first strike had landed, and the galaxy would never be the same. But there was no time for celebration. Victory was an illusion, a temporary reprieve. The Empire had suffered a setback, not a defeat. A single battle meant nothing to an enemy that spanned thousands of star systems, whose resources were beyond comprehension. The loss of a fleet, even one as large as this, was an inconvenience at most. Retaliation would come. It was not a question of if, but when. Earth's leaders knew this. Military command had already shifted from battle to aftermath, moving with the same urgency that had allowed them to survive the initial attack. Recovery operations began immediately. Every intact wreck was scanned for usable technology, every piece of enemy equipment analyzed. There was no wasted opportunity. The Empire's fallen ships held knowledge, and knowledge was the most valuable weapon humanity could acquire. Engineers and scientists worked around the clock, salvaging anything they could. Hull compositions, weapon systems, propulsion technology, every component was a potential key to bridging the technological gap. Even the most damaged fragments were studied, reverse-engineered, broken apart, and rebuilt to be understood. What once belonged to the Empire would now serve humanity. Captured enemy databanks were a priority. The Cyber Warfare Division, fresh from its success in destabilizing the flagship, was now tasked with extracting information from whatever was left of the fleet's command network. There were no guarantees, no certainty that anything of value remained intact, but even the smallest piece of intelligence could mean the difference between survival and extinction. Every encrypted file, every corrupted data cluster was a puzzle to be solved. Meanwhile, humanity's forces repositioned. Earth's defenses, though battered, remained intact. The asteroid belts, the repurposed mining stations, the satellite networks, all were still operational, and now they had been tested in real combat. The system was no longer an unknown variable. It was a battlefield that had proven itself. But it would not be enough for what was coming. Plans were drafted for the next phase. The war had begun, and Earth could no longer rely on defensive measures alone. The next strike had to be humanity's. If they waited for the Empire to return, they would be wiped out. They had to go on the offensive, force the Empire onto the back foot before it could recover. The first step was expansion. Humanity's presence in the solar system had always been limited, focused on Earth, Mars, and the scattered colonies on Jupiter's moons. That was no longer acceptable. Defensive installations on Luna were reinforced, its underground bases expanded into full-scale command centers. The asteroid belt became more than a minefield, it became a fortress. New shipyards were established, hidden within the deep shadows of Saturn's rings, far from immediate detection. The war would not be fought from Earth alone. It would be waged from every rock and moon that could be turned into an asset. Humanity needed more ships. Their fleet had survived, but it was still outmatched by even a fraction of the Empire's strength. Conventional shipbuilding methods were too slow, too inefficient. The solution came from necessity. Civilian cargo haulers were stripped down and refitted with weapons. Passenger liners became makeshift carriers, holding drone swarms instead of travelers. Every vessel that could be repurposed was converted into a warship, every scrapyard combed for parts. The distinction between military and civilian blurred. There was no longer a difference. Everyone was now part of the war effort. Training intensified. The soldiers who had survived the first battle were rotated into instruction roles, spreading their experience to fresh recruits. Simulations were built from real battle data, refining tactics, correcting mistakes. The next generation of fighters would not be going into the unknown. They would be prepared. They would know what worked, what didn't. They would be better than those who came before. The question of allies remained. Humanity had fought alone, but they knew there were others out there, species that had been crushed under the Empire's rule. Some had watched the battle unfold from a distance. Some had stayed silent, afraid to act. But the proof was undeniable. The Empire had bled. It had lost. And that meant something. Covert signals were sent out. Messages crafted with precision, designed to reach those who might be willing to listen. Humanity did not ask for help. They did not beg for support. They simply presented a truth: the Empire could be fought. It could be resisted. And if others wished to stand, now was the time. The responses were cautious. Some ignored the call entirely, unwilling to risk drawing attention. Others sent quiet acknowledgments, not pledging allegiance but not dismissing the possibility either. And then there were the few who answered with action. Smugglers arrived first, bringing stolen supplies and black market technology. Dissidents within the Empire's own ranks leaked strategic information, knowing they could not act openly but refusing to stand idle. A handful of rebel ships, outdated and outgunned, pledged their support, not for humanity, but for the chance to strike back at the force that had taken everything from them. It was not much. But it was more than nothing. The Empire would not sit idle. Their retaliation would be calculated, overwhelming, merciless. The loss of their fleet was not something they would accept without consequence. They would analyze every mistake, correct every failure. The next wave would not arrive expecting surrender. It would come to exterminate. Humanity knew this. And they were ready. Their forces were no longer scattered, their defenses no longer makeshift. Their fleet, though still small, was now tested in war. Their strategy had evolved. They would not face the Empire as they had before. They would adapt, as they always had. The war had begun. There was no turning back. The Empire's retaliation came swiftly. There was no pretense of diplomacy, no demands for surrender. The destruction of their fleet had been an insult that could not go unanswered. This time, there would be no warnings, no ultimatums. The next wave would not be a show of force, it would be annihilation. Humanity's spies had intercepted fragmented transmissions. The Empire's response was not just another fleet, but a full-scale extermination force. The armada being assembled was unlike anything seen before. The Empire had underestimated Earth once, but it would not make the same mistake again. What was coming was not an invasion. It was a purge. The final preparations began. Factories on Mars operated at full capacity, producing weapons and ships without pause. The shipyards hidden within Saturn's rings pushed out war vessels faster than they could be crewed. Automated defense grids were expanded, orbital stations converted into gun platforms. There would be no escape, no retreat. If Earth fell, it would take as many of the enemy with it as possible. The Empire's fleets moved through space like an approaching storm, their numbers dwarfing the first wave. Hundreds of warships, each one larger and more powerful than anything humanity had ever built. Their weapons could crack continents, their soldiers bred for slaughter. Against such overwhelming force, surrender would have been the logical choice. But humanity had long abandoned logic. When the Armada arrived at the edge of the Sol system, they did not find a cowering world waiting for destruction. They found a battlefield meticulously prepared for their arrival. The asteroid belt had been turned into a death trap. Countless projectiles, hidden within the fields of debris, launched at terrifying velocities. They were not just random weapons but carefully guided kinetic missiles, their trajectories calculated down to the millisecond. Empire's ships swerved, trying to evade, but even the most advanced shielding could not withstand the sheer force of planetary-scale bombardment. The moment they adjusted, the second phase began. Satellite stations, thought to be nothing more than observation outposts, powered up and unleashed waves of directed energy, carving through smaller ships like paper. Their targeting systems had been preloaded with data from the previous battle, optimized to exploit known weaknesses. The first casualties fell before the Empire's fleet had even fired a shot. But they did fire. And when they did, the battlefield burned. Their primary weapons were devastating, cutting through entire swaths of humanity's defenses. Space stations were incinerated in seconds. The first defensive fleet, outnumbered and outgunned, fought desperately, harassing the enemy with rapid-hit tactics. They did not expect to survive. They only had to buy time. Because the real fight was already happening elsewhere. Stealth teams, deployed days before, had infiltrated the enemy fleet in the chaos of battle. The lessons of the first engagement had been refined. These were not suicide missions. They had a purpose. Their targets were the enemy's command relays, the very infrastructure that allowed the Empire's vast forces to coordinate. The sabotage was precise, targeted at critical points where the loss of a single system could send entire battle groups into disarray. And it worked. As the Empire's ships attempted to press their advantage, delays and confusion rippled through their ranks. Orders arrived late, fleet movements became erratic. Some ships fired on friendly targets, mistaking them for enemy vessels in the chaos. For an empire built on rigid hierarchy, even a moment of disorder was enough to shift the balance. Then, humanity's main fleet emerged. They had never intended to meet the Empire head-on in the opening attack. Instead, they had waited, hidden in the gravitational shadows of Jupiter's moons, conserving energy signatures, avoiding detection. Now, with the enemy's formation partially broken, they struck. Humanity had learned from the first battle. Their ships were faster, their weapons more refined. Every pilot, every commander, knew that survival was not guaranteed. This was a war of attrition, and they would take down as many of the enemy as possible before they fell. The fight became chaotic, brutal. Empire's ships outmatched human vessels in direct combat, but the battlefield had been shaped to favor Earth's forces. For every warship lost, an enemy vessel fell with it. The battle stretched across days, either side relenting. The Empire's strategy had been simple: overwhelm and crush. But humanity did not break. Their attacks were relentless, unpredictable, their ability to adapt unlike anything the Empire had faced before. Then came the final stroke. The Empire's command ship, the vessel responsible for directing the entire assault, was their greatest strength and their greatest weakness. It was the core of their military doctrine: absolute control from the top, unyielding structure. But that meant if the head was cut off, the body would collapse. And so, humanity aimed for the head. A single strike team, equipped with everything humanity had learned about Empire technology, infiltrated the command vessel in the midst of battle. They were not there to fight. They were there to end the war. The virus they carried was designed not just to disable, but to turn the Empire's own systems against them. Within minutes of its activation, targeting systems glitched, propulsion engines shut down, entire divisions of the fleet lost contact with one another. The final blow came not from humanity's weapons but from the Empire's own. Their command ship, disabled, drifted directly into the path of their fleet's primary bombardment cannons. There was no way to stop it. The fleet's own weapons tore through their leader's vessel, breaking it apart from the inside. And then, just like that, it was over. The remaining Empire forces, leaderless and in disarray, did not retreat. They did not surrender. They simply ceased to function as a unified force. Some fought on, blind and furious. Others drifted without orders, waiting for commands that would never come. It was the end of their structure, the end of their dominance in this battle. Humanity had done it. The war was not over. The Empire still existed, still commanded vast forces beyond the Sol system. But this battle had shattered the illusion of their invincibility. A species that was meant to be crushed had risen and struck back. The galaxy would hear of this. Others, long subjugated, would take notice. The idea of resistance, once unthinkable, was now a reality. Earth still stood. Humanity still stood. And the Empire, for the first time in its history, had learned what it meant to be afraid.